Good afternoon to all the viewers. Today we are going to discuss India's G20 presidency. Basically, it is the hot topic as of now, and you very well know that India has conducted a very successful G20 summit in New Delhi. So what we are basically going to do is that we will be basically examining the concept of G20, right? What is G20? What are the different aims, objectives, structure, right? What are its characteristics, okay, as an organization? And after that we will do a small geopolitical scan, because this summit has come at a very opportune time where there are geo-economic and geopolitical changes that are happening around the world. And after that we will come to India's G20 presidency right in the last part, okay. So what we basically know very well now is that as most of you must have been reading newspapers, and you are very well aware that this was most ambitious G20 presidency in history of G20, right? When I say ambitious, it means it set the bar very high, right? Because the first point that tells you about being ambitious is that the total number of documents that have come out of this meeting is around 112 documents under India's presidency, right? Now if you make a comparison of what were the documents in the last presidency, because last president was Indonesia, so it was around 50 documents, and before that it was Italy, where it was basically 65 documents. So this is why it has been ambitious, because it set the bar very high, right? Nothing is binding from G20, right? Everything that comes out of G20 is all about consensus, okay? These are not legally binding agreements, but the point is, if India was able to get the other countries agree on 112 documents, that means it shows the level of commitment of our government, of our bureaucrats, of all the people involved in conduct of this summit, right? So this is why it was most ambitious and the grandest G20 that the world has ever seen, right? So in this context, we are going to examine what is G20 and what is all about this concept. So the first thing that need to know as we discuss G20 is that the members and the structure, right? So basically G20, if you see, it is an intergovernmental forum that comprises of 19 countries and the European Union. So basically it is G20 plus G20 is combination of these 19 countries plus one. But you very well know that there is one more organization which has now become a member, which is the African Union. So currently G20 has translated and made this transition to G21, right? So that is the first thing, right? So this is the membership. And apart from these countries, what also happens is that you also have international organizations and guest countries that are invited to participate. Now international organizations, basically G20 itself is an international organization. It is a multilateral platform. So what you will find is that whenever there is a meeting of G20, you will also find representatives from other international organizations, like the United Nations is one. Then you will have the representatives from World Bank, IMF, all the other organizations, Asian Development Bank, right? So all they are invited because these are the other multilateral platforms through which policy making happens. So all these people are invited so that they are aware that what happened at G20, right? So next time when there is a meeting of World Bank, you will carry the consensus that has happened through G20, and based on that document you will have other negotiations in World Bank. So basically G20 becomes a forum through which coordination happens by various international organizations, right? So that is the critical part. Why do you have these organizations present, and also the guest countries, right? Now inviting the guest countries basically is a prerogative of the host country, right? So it depends on the host country how many countries they would want to invite as guests, and these are generally the countries which are close to the host country. And then of course there are informal meetings happening between the G20 members, heads of the states, and also the heads of the government or states that have been invited as guests. For example, you must have seen informal meetings between the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, who was invited by our Prime Minister as a guest, Sheikh Hasina, right? So she basically was having informal meetings during the dinner that was organized organized by the President of India. So it becomes a platform through which, you cultivate relations and you do your networking part, right? So that is also one of the philosophies why you have these invited countries. Then of course, what exactly is the significance of G20? This is the significance of G20 because it accounts for around 85% of the world GDP, 75% of the total international trade, and 2/3 of the global population, right? So technically, if you see in terms of trade, 85% of the world GDP and 75% of the international trade, that is conducted through G20. So basically, in a nutshell, if I were to tell you, G20 is the center nerve of international trade because these G20 countries account for around 75% of the international trade, right? So this shows the significance that whatever is decided at this platform will have serious implications for other global platforms, right? So that is the critical part because this is a platform to make understanding or reach consensus, right? Now, if you go back to the history, it was founded in the year 1999 in a response to several economic crises. At that time, there was an economic crisis in Asia, 1998, right? So to respond to these problems, there was need felt that you need to have some platform. Because see, if you go back a little earlier, in 1991, the nature of the global politics itself had changed, right? So what had happened at that time was that there was dissolution of Soviet Union and there was no communism around the world, right? So ideology had changed, you had rise of new powers, many countries coming and seeking membership in World Bank, IMF. So to coordinate all that and to take care of the economic problems, it was felt that in 99 you need to have a platform where there should be some dialogue between the developing and the developed and the developing countries. This is why it was founded. G20 was founded in the year 1990 at the level of finance ministers, right? So the level at which it was founded was basically finance ministers, not the heads of the states or governments. Okay. Then of course, it went on, but there was another serious crisis that happened in 2008, and that is what brought, the format was changed, and then it was felt that, there are certain issues that need to be taken care of by the heads of the governments or of states themselves, and this is why it made a transition from being a grouping at the level of ministers. Then it became a summit level where you will have a head of the state or head of the government coming and participating, and you have leaders summit since 2008, right? So this is, more about the very general background about G20, and then there is also a need to discuss what is the organization and what has been the agenda of G20, right? So basically, if you see, G20 does not have a permanent secretariat, right? It is not, as I said, it is more like a platform than a serious organization. So what happens is that they don't have a fixed up secretariat. So what happens is that a country which is hosting G20 for 1 year, meetings at all the levels, that particular country will build a temporary secretariat, right? So you build a secretariat and through which all the coordination takes place. So that is one point. The second is, it is working at 3 levels, right? G20 works at 3 levels. First one is you have Sherpa track coordination, right? So Sherpas basically are the representatives of the respective heads of the states or governments. One individual who represents the country in negotiations that happen, all through the year you will have negotiations happening on climate change, on agriculture, on all these issues. So you technically need to have a Sherpa, right? So these Sherpas, so Sherpa track basically is, it coordinates economic issues such as agriculture, anti-corruption, climate, digital economy, education, employment, energy, environment, health, tourism, etc. So there is a big list on which these Sherpas keep negotiating all through the year, right? And mind you, these negotiations go at many levels, ministers and all those levels. Ultimately, these negotiations and understandings lead to the final document, which is today you have New Delhi Declaration, right? So it is a combination of effort that has been put by the officials all through the year, right? Then you come to the finance track, right? And finance track basically is headed by the finance ministers and the central bank governors, right? Who are generally meeting 4 times a year, okay? And here what happens is that they are work in areas like global economy, infrastructure, financial regulation, financial inclusion, international financial architecture, right? So basically you have these two parallel tracks on which one is headed by the Sherpas, another one comes under the financial track which is headed by the finance ministers and also the central bank governors, right? So these are the two official tracks, right? And then there is unofficial track, right? Unofficial generally is track 2 in diplomacy, which means here you have engagement groups or civil society groups, right? For example, we had Women 20, right? Or other examples were there. So basically, this is the track 2, unofficial level happening simultaneously, right? And what generally happens is, these groups, they draft recommendations to G20 leaders that contribute to the policy making process, right? And there are currently 11 engagement groups at the moment, right? So these engagement groups that I told you, in total they are 11 at the moment, and as I said, whatever consensus they reach, it finally adds to the final document. Okay, then it is also quite interesting that the presidency, the system of presidency is supported by a troika. Troika here means the previous president, the current president and the incoming president, right? So basically it is a system in which you depend on the legacy created by the previous president, then you are the main host, you carry forward his legacy and you add your own points, and of course you pass on the baton to the other host. Now, so what has happened is that if you recall, India took the presidency of G20 from Indonesia last year in Bali, right? So we took up the presidency, then we were in touch with whatever the Bali declaration was in front of us. So we carried that understanding, we added our own initiatives. So it is now Delhi declaration, and we have given the baton to Brazil, because Brazil is going to host the next G20, and after Brazil, mind you, it will be hosted by South Africa. So what you see here is that consecutively 4 global south countries were the host, right? Starting with Indonesia, then you had India, then there will be Brazil, and there will be South Africa. So this is why, keeping this in mind, if you see India's thrust on global G20, it was global south. We deliberately chose the agenda of global south, keeping in mind these 4 presidencies and the issues that are currently happening in the global geopolitics and economics. We were convinced that there is only one theme that can do justice to G20, and that is the global south. I'll come to that a little later, right? So at the same time, also keep this thing in mind that G20 is also informal in another sense, that the decisions that are taken at G20, they are important, but they do not get implemented automatically, right? It is not that you just simply have a declaration and people have agreed and they go back and implement the decisions. This is not the way it works. You carry the meaning and consensus, right? And when you have other meetings, so that consensus becomes the bedrock of further negotiations. So for example, you have climate change, certain consensus has been built by India. So this will be the basic consensus whenever you have negotiations on climate change. So then it becomes, a bedrock to lay a bigger foundation. Okay, right? So this is some about the organization and the agenda. Now, the another point that we need to keep in mind, because this was basically a meeting that was hosted by India. So we should also have a look about the theme of the G20, right? Now, theme here is very important, because if you see Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, right? It is a Sanskrit phrase which means the whole world is a family, right? And this is, this is what we came out, was the central theme: one earth, one family and one future, right? So basically, when you treat earth as a family, naturally you have this feeling that you need to do something for the family. By the way, the world is so diverse, right? That what India has been doing is that even India is a diverse country, right? So we have just implemented our internal, experience, developmental experience, and we have just juxtaposed that experience to the global platform, right? So Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam is the basic belief which comes from the ancient Sanskrit text of Maha Upanishad, right? So it is mentioned in our Upanishads, right? And essentially, the theme affirms the value of all life, whether it is human, animal, plant and microorganisms, and also their interconnectedness on the planet Earth and in the wider universe. So basically, if you recall, our Prime Minister said that, you know, it should be human-centric globalization, right? So this is the connection. Humans and everybody is connected. So at the focus of globalization has to be the human beings, right? And of course, if you see these 7 petals of lotus that are there in the symbol, they represent 7 continents of the globe and also 7 notes of music, right? So this is basically the theme and what has been contribution from India's side to come out with its own, you know, ancient culture and combine that with the global governance aspects, right? Then what has happened is that, you know, you should also know what are the characteristics of G20, because it is very important to understand this as a platform, because it has certain characteristics, right? The first one is it is a multilateral platform, right? So when you say G20 is a multilateral platform, there are many multilateral platforms in the world, right? So you have many multilateral platforms in the world. Out of them, one is G20. So for example, G20 is one. You have UN, right? You have G7, right? There is BRICS plus now, right? So what I am trying to tell you that where multilateral is where you have presence of many countries, right? And multilateral also has another sense, which is that it is, you know, in these platforms you have this feeling of what you are going for common good of humanity. Yeah, you need to achieve international cooperation, right? So this is what do you mean by a multilateral platform. So basically G20 is a multilateral platform. So that is one. Basically it is a political principle that favors cooperation between nations to promote common good, right? So that is one point. Now second issue here is that if you see G20 in its membership, you will find the developed or the G7 countries and also the developing economies, right? So basically if I were to tell you, G20 is all about what you call the north-south, right? Right, these are two economic identities, north south, right? There is a divide in terms of economics in the world, right? It is called the north south divide. So G7 countries are the developed ones, these are the northern part, and south are global south as we know it, right? All the developing countries. So now, you know, this is the lens that, you know, defines the relationship, right? So G7 coming together with all the global, you know, these global south countries, right? So basically we need to have some consensus because their level of development and our level of development is basically very, very diverse, right? So we need to have policies which are in sync. They should reflect the realities of global south as well, right? So this is one of the characteristics of G20, that it is a platform which reflects both the northern economies, the global north, and also the global south. So that is the second point. The third one is, as I mentioned earlier, the decisions are not legally binding, but members make commitments that carry political weight, right? Say for example, you are agreeing to a statement that okay, we will cut by our emissions by 2% or whatever is the case, but tomorrow, you know, it becomes very difficult to backtrack from these negotiations, I mean these commitments, because you know it carries a political risk for you, right? So the main platform, or you know, the main function here is consensus building, right? They may not be legally binding, but you agree to a consensus, a spirit, okay? So that is the third part. The fourth one, of course, is if you see the very nature of G20, it is a platform where you only discuss security issues, right? So G20 is a platform where you only have security issues, and you very well know, sorry, security issues are not discussed, you have economic issues only, right? Now if you see what has happened since Ukraine happened is that economic issues have been put on a back burner very generally, and there is an attempt to discuss security issues through the G20 platform. This is what has created problems, right? In Bali also remember, there a lot of time was taken to agree to a statement, a final declaration, because Ukraine was creating problems, right? The Russian stand has been very clear that since it is not a platform that discusses security, why to bring the Ukraine issue here, right? So this has become a problem. It was even a challenge for India, right? But see, diplomatically, it was a win for India's diplomacy. Why? Because bringing together so many diverse interests on the issue of Ukraine and getting a para on Ukraine itself shows the commitment, right? And we were oriented towards getting a result, right? It is a result-oriented diplomacy because India had put its foot down and said, we want a statement. The final outcome is already there with you. You just agree to a paragraph, right? So this is what we did. So G20 basically is an economic platform where you do not discuss security issues. That has been the general case, okay? Then, apart from this, G20 also, there are discussions going on. There are some people around the world which would say that is G20 alternate to the UN? Because see, UN basically, if you see, UN discriminates between different countries because the charter of the UN says that all the countries are equal, right? But the issue is the concept of veto power in the UN Security Council violates the principle of equality, right? There is some privilege given to these 5 countries above other countries, but there is nothing as such in G20. And more so, nobody has a veto, nobody can exercise a veto power, and there has to be consensus. So there are many people in the world now who are saying that G20 may replace UN in terms of decision making. I mean, this is a far-fetched idea, but the comparison is being made very, very clearly now, right? So that is yet another characteristic of it, okay? And of course, what has happened is that a big chunk of countries, when you say G20, that means 20 countries are on the table and almost 180, 185 countries are not on the table. So they are watching the meetings. So what has happened is that a group of small and medium-sized UN member states, they have formed an informal group which is called Global Governance Group, or the 3G, with the aim of developing a constructive dialogue on coordination and cooperation between the G20 members on one side and non-G20 members on the other side. So this is the impact of G20, that there is a big chunk of countries which are not members in G20. They have formed their own grouping. It is called 3G, or the Global Governance Group, and they are trying to have some negotiations or some dialogue with the countries that are there in G20. So see the direct impact, right? So this is how, these are some of the characteristics of G20 and how it is leading to some changes in the system, right? Now, as I said, we need to do a serious geopolitical scan because this meeting comes at a time where you have these things happening, right? Say, for example, the first one is Russia-Ukraine crisis, right? So when you talk about the first problem, Russia-Ukraine crisis, this has been creating a problem on G20 because I just mentioned starting last year, Russia has been opposing these G7 countries because Western countries have imposed sanctions on Russia, right? And they want to if you recall, Prime Minister of UK had conveyed to our Prime Minister that India should condemn Russia's aggression against Ukraine, right? But here the point is, we are taking a middle path. So how do you reconcile this problem at the a G20 declaration level? It becomes a problem. And the second issue, of course, is it is known to you that whenever there is a conflict, it is going to supply chains will be hit, whether it is fuel, whether it is fertilizers, right, or whether it is food supplies, everything has been hit, right? So it has an economic impact now, right? And the global south position is that we are not putting sanctions on Russia, but we have been calling on the Russians to end this war because it is mentioned in the New Delhi Declaration that this is not a time for war. So without condemning, you can deal with the Russians. That can be one of the more polite ways to do it, okay, right? So that is one impact, this was having an impact on G20, right? The second issue is, and this is related to the first one, which is the West-Russia tensions, right? The sanctions part. The Western countries have imposed sanctions on Russia, right? It is the most sanctioned country in the world at the moment, even in the history of global politics. It is the most sanctioned country today, and their supply chains have been, hit because they can't trade with the Americans, they are not trading with the Westerners. So Russia is changing its own supply chains towards Asia, Africa, Latin America, right? So that understanding, it is all happening because of Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? So this is yet another problem. The third one, of course, is the Western countries are facing you can say combined might of Russia and China, because West is also taking on China at the moment, right? It was all started under the Trump government in the US, where you had this trade war happening between US and China, and it has led to serious economic issues between the two sides, right? So even the Chinese will be sitting with the Russians and on issues like, say, trade is just one aspect, right? But even if you take the Ukraine issue, right, then China is sitting like a hawk, because they also have an eye on Taiwan, right? They may try to do what Russia has done in Ukraine. China tomorrow might want to do the same thing in Taiwan, right? So anything which is anti-Russia in this statement, even China won't support it, right? That is the direct connection. Okay, so this is also a problem. Then comes the fourth part, which is COVID-19 and supply chain disruption, right? Many economies around the world are still, in a phase where they have not come out of the economic negative impacts of the COVID-19. Their supply chains were hit mainly, right? And they are still struggling to achieve the pre-pandemic growth rates, okay? So, and by the way, most of the countries that have been hit generally, again, are they from global south, okay? And then, of course, it is very important dimension here, which is the recent expansion of BRICS, right? BRICS has been expanded to, have countries like, you have, the other members have been included. Now what happens, like Egypt is just one example. So now what happens is that this expansion basically creates dilemmas, right? Because on one hand you have G20 countries where there is representation of the Western economies. I said G7 is present here. But BRICS, by its very nature, it was always a grouping of global south. So you don't have any representation of the Western countries in the BRICS, on the BRICS platform. So technically it has been a global south platform, and if it expands, even by the expansion, they have not taken Western countries. You have somebody like Argentina, right? Or you have somebody like Iran or Saudi Arabia. So if they are coming into the grouping, now what is happening is that non-Western and global South aspect is emerging. It is expanding. But from India's point of view, there is a dilemma, because expansion of BRICS should not reduce it to an anti-Western grouping. Because in BRICS, if you see the economic size and everything compared, China is the biggest elephant in the room, right? So we do not want to end up in a grouping where China has an overbearing dominance, right? So we had to balance that expansion, right? And if you see, there is an overlap of some of the countries that are there in G20, part of Global South, which have a good relationship with India. They have found a place in this BRICS expansion as well, right? So that is another point we had to keep in mind. And in October, we are going to have third BRI forum. That is also very important, because see, the public opinion around China's Belt and Road Initiative is changing, and this was one of the reasons why China wanted an expansion of BRICS, because they want to take on the Americans, right, in terms of economy and almost everything. So the third BRI forum is happening in October, where the Chinese say that so far 90 countries have given their acceptance to participate. Now you very well know two things have happened in China. One, of course, is their economic issues in last 1-2 years, and of course the biggest issue is that BRI is associated with debt traps. They have not come out with sustainable developmental policies, right? So what happens in October, it will always carry some signs from G20 New Delhi declaration, right? And mind you, President Xi Jinping was not present in New Delhi, because see, his problem is very critical. He cannot see India rising the way India's stock is rising in the Western countries, right? He has a problem with this. And ironically, mind you, China is the country which changed sides with Soviet, with Soviet Union in 1971. They were a Soviet partner, but a little before they made their mind before 1971, and they cultivated a close relationship with the Western countries. But today they have a problem if India cultivates a good, strong bond with the Western countries, right? So this is also going to have an impact, right? And then, of course, I've already told you the North-South divide part, the Global North having a presentation and Global South having a presentation at the same platform, right? And the last thing here is, which has an impact here, is India-China relations, right? There are tensions in India's relationship with China, because since the clash in Galwan, right, ever since that Galwan Valley clash happened, our relationship with China has not been normal since 2020. Okay, so basically these, this geopolitical scan gives you a picture that it was very, very important for India to have a declaration in place, because a declaration is generally seen as success or failure of the host country's diplomacy. And mind you, it is ambitious in the sense, as I told you, because we have, almost the number of documents and the way India and our Prime Minister, spent personal capital into organizing G20. We made it a people's movement, right? So far it was not the case, but you see all the cities of India, G20 is the flavor of the season, right? So we have directly connected that human-centric globalization with the people in India, and the themes that we came out with, it is all about human-centric globalization, right? So this is what happened this is the geopolitical scan, and it is the list of the countries that were invited by India as the guests, right? So you have Bangladesh, Egypt, Mauritius, Netherlands, Nigeria, Oman, UAE, Spain and Singapore, right? So these countries were invited by India as guests because, mind you, all of these countries have their own significant deep relationship with India. I can give you one example of Bangladesh. This is how diplomacy has an impact on G20. If you see the recent trend, there is an election that is going to happen in Bangladesh. Now, America, right, they have been having their own issues with Bangladesh, right? Whenever there are elections, right, being a custodian of human rights, democracy, America has a habit of commenting on issues of other countries. So they have been putting the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina under a pressure. Whenever there is an election, they will say that these were sham elections. These were not real elections because the opposition has been put in jail. So she feels a pressure, right? We gave that respect to Bangladesh because for India, it is #1 partner in South Asia, whether it is security, whether it is trade. Our relationship with Bangladesh is excellent, right? They have been very, very cooperating with India in terms of security. So we had to naturally give that respect to the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, and she was invited on the platform of G20 where she was sharing the dais with President Biden, right? And during the meeting, you must have seen the pictures also. So this is what you can do. You can facilitate a communication between different heads of the governments who generally do not have a very good view about each other, right? So that ways, every country is important in that context from India's point of view, right? So these are the guests, and then we come to the outcome part, right? What exactly was the outcome of India's efforts that we have been taking, right? From December till this September, India has done a lot of hard work, and that gets reflected in the number of outcomes that we have been able to achieve. So first and foremost is that we have, basically we have democratized the idea of G20 and we have ensured it expands, right? Why? Because now African Union will be joining as the 21st country and it becomes G21, okay? Now here, see, the point here is Africa had the highest ever participation in this G20. Before this, it was never the case. How? South Africa is a member in G20, Mauritius, Egypt and Nigeria were the guests, and African Union was chaired by Comoros, right? So in this G20, African Union for the first time in history had the highest representation, right, in terms of members attending. So that was one highlight of India's diplomacy. And of course, if you see poor African countries, they pay 4 times more interest on loans than the US. See the ironical part, this is where the North-South divide comes into the picture. That if America takes a loan, they just pay 1 rupee. But if you are from Africa, you have to pay a 4 rupee interest, 4 times. That is, and if you go a little further, and it is 8 times more than European countries. See the G7 this is the point that I was trying to tell you. The North-South divide has a way to play out in different ways. Africa has not been treated with the spirit of equality, and we ensured that at least their voice is being heard on the G20 platform, right? So that is one way we democratized the idea and we ensured it expands. So now you have G20 becoming G21, all thanks to the efforts of Indian government. So that is one point, the first primary thing. Then we come to the second issue, right? If you recall, India has been placing itself as a voice of Global South, right? And Global South generally are those countries, which are developing countries or least developed countries, right? So what has happened is that in January this year, we conducted an inaugural Voice of the Global South Summit, in which there was participation from 125 countries, representatives of Global South coming together and setting the agenda. And inputs were taken by our government, and those inputs formed part of India's G20 presidency, right? So that is one, triumph for us. Second, of course, is that Global South has suffered the most due to Russia-Ukraine conflict, as I mentioned earlier, food, fuel and fertilizers, the 3 Fs, okay? So if you are the ones suffering the most because of a problem that you did not create, but you are ready to resolve that problem, because if you see almost all the countries in Global South, they have not put sanctions on Russia. They continue to advocate for diplomacy and negotiation, and we have been saying that we are ready to support in any way, right, if there is a chance to resolve this conflict. So this was also important. And of course, economic repercussions of COVID-19 still being felt in Global South. This is why our Prime Minister said that we require a human-centric globalization, right? Globalization should not create a big divide between haves and have-nots. It has to be human-centric. Human here means human security, right? Humans have basic securities. You require employment, you require access to food, you require place to stay. So to make humans secure, this is what was one of the outcomes of India's New Delhi Declaration, right? You set the agenda, okay? So that is what happened from the declaration. And then comes to what has been India's direct contribution, right? As a country, what is that you can contribute apart from agenda setting, right? So the first thing that directly comes out is that there is something called global public goods, right? So if you talk about global public goods, what are global public goods? They are available basically to all the citizens beyond borders, right? So for example, right to breathe clean air is one global public good, right? Everybody today has a right to have a vaccine against COVID-19. This is another global public good. So basically you are extending the idea of public goods beyond borders because of globalization, right? A country like India has been, and mind you, India is still a developing country, right? We have our own internal challenges. India is the most populous country in the world. Despite that, going by the philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, India has been thinking for the people who are beyond its own borders, right? So to do that, what we have done is that we have come out with Global Biofuel Alliance. This is the first one, right? Global Biofuel Alliance, basically the 3 founding members, India, US and Brazil, these are the 3 founding members. And basically they are also leading biofuel producers and consumers also, right? So biofuel are being considered through the Global Biofuel Alliance, and what it will do is that it would help accelerate global efforts to meet net zero emissions targets by facilitating trade in biofuels derived from sources including plant and animal waste, right? So for example, you do some blending, right? 20% is what you mix in your petrol, and this is how you bring down the emissions, right? So this is what India has been doing, and India has also proposed to establish a green hydrogen innovation center, right? So this is yet another idea that comes from India's contribution. Our own minds sat down and said that these are the things we should be contributing for future generations, sustainable development, right? Then another contribution when you talk about New Delhi Declaration is that it is something called DPI, Digital Public Infrastructure, right? And see, it is a success story that has been recognized by World Bank recently, right? I'll come to that point, but before that, it is part of India's soft power, right? India's success on landing on moon, it is part of India's soft power, right? India's digital public infrastructure is part of our soft power, because these things are these are strengths, right? And these are very cheap, right? So this is why they're part of your soft power. Now, to help other countries which want to build digital public infrastructure like UPI, Aadhaar, CoWIN, etc., for financial inclusion and delivery of public services in an effective manner, right? By having Aadhaar, by having, UPI payment systems. What we have done is that, you are very well aware of that gem trinity, right? Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile, right? So by having a mobile phone, you have a financial inclusion because you download an app and you are able to pay using that app. So this is financial inclusion, okay? So you combine technology, combine your public, digital infrastructure, and you also ensure delivery of public services in a very, very effective manner. You end up, in a sense, you end up eliminating corruption and middlemen totally, okay? So another point is that, we have also proposed for creation of a global digital public infrastructure repository, right? It is a proposal that India has floated that we will maintain this repository, and whichever G20 countries want to make contributions or do something, they are most welcome to join it, okay? Then after this, as part of this DPI, India has also proposed to set up a One Future Alliance, right? It is a voluntary initiative to build capacity, provide technical assistance and adequate funding support for implementing DPI in low and middle income countries, right? That is another way, right? The way India has been taking up issues of global south in climate change, we are also taking up issues in terms of digital connectivity, right? And mind you, it has, although it is not directly connected, but in a sense it is connected with China, right? Because see, what the Chinese have been doing is that they are also working on connectivity, but their connectivity is something other. For example, if you go to Central Asia, you will find the Chinese building what you call a safe city projects, right? So they are going into some country like Kyrgyzstan, and they will tell the city police that in Bishkek we are going to build a safe city. That means we will install these surveillance cameras for movement of traffic and all that stuff. But the problem here is that it is an example of digital colonialism, because ultimately the data will be stored somewhere in Chinese servers. That creates the problem. India is democratizing the idea of digital public infrastructure, being a democracy, and this is, you have a comparison right next to your door, okay? Anyways, so coming back, so One Future Alliance is all about this, and then the praise given, done by World Bank for Indian government. The World Bank in its G20 document praised India's DPI, commending India's remarkable achievements in just 6 years, accomplishments that would have typically taken 5 decades to realize. I am not saying this. The World Bank report says that it would have taken 5 decades, but the current government did this in 6 years, right? It speaks, a lot about the way you are working to get your people financial and, included in the system through using digital means, right? And it is, since we are very, very fresh from our Chandrayaan success, the government of India also proposed that we propose to have a G20 satellite mission for environment and climate observation, right? And the aim from India's point of view is that climate and weather data will be shared with the countries of global south, right? So this is yet another, outcome of the document Delhi Declaration, right? And then of course, you also have reform of the multilateral development banks, right? Now here the critical aspect is that G20 members acknowledge the need for an international development finance system that can help developing and LDCs. LDCs here are least developed countries, okay? So tackle climate change, right? So basically there is an understanding that climate change is a problem, and these least developed countries generally have no source of funding, right? So there has to be a reform of the multilateral development banks, right? And MDBs like the World Bank are often the only viable source of poorer nations funding required for infrastructure and clean energy projects, okay? And here, the problem is, again you come back to the North-South divide, because 6 years before Paris Agreement, the developed nations vowed to provide 100 billion per year by 2020 to the developing countries to combat climate change, but as of today, that guarantee has not been met. So it is also a story of unmet promises, right? But as a developing country, we found this platform useful to remind the developed countries of their commitment that they made in 6 years before, right? So it is some sort of a consensus that all the countries recognize that funding mechanisms need to come up for the poorer countries for climate change, right? So that was there. And of course, at the same time, the G20 countries have also promised to work towards tripling the global renewable energy capacity by 2030. That is a key outcome, right? If met, this single step could avoid carbon dioxide emissions by 7 billion tons between now and 2030, which is a big amount, mind you, okay? And according to an assessment by the data has been released by International Energy Agency, right? So we have at least reached some consensus. If it is implemented, it will be counted as a milestone, because the consensus was reached at the Delhi a meeting of G20, right? And of course, at the same time, there are two more important things that have come out from the G20 Delhi declaration. One of them is that the New Delhi Leaders Declaration has announced the creation of a working group on empowerment of women, right, to support the G20 Women's Ministerial, and the first meeting of the working group will take place during Brazil's G20 presidency, right? It has been agreed that women play a critical part in sustainable development, and to ensure this, next year, whenever there is a G20 meeting, you will see the first women's ministerial happening under the presidency of Brazil. So they will be taking forward this idea, but this idea has come up from New Delhi's presidency, right? And the last, point here is that G20 also announced its commitment to halve the digital gender gap by 2030. Women, because of the gender, there is gender discrimination around the world. The G20 has agreed that by the year 2030, we will have the digital gender gap, right? So that is another commitment that all the countries have agreed to achieve, okay? So these were the major outcomes of G20 meeting, but mind you, there was one more announcement, although it is not directly connected to G20, mind you, right? Because I am basically talking about this corridor, but it is very important in India's foreign policy and economic issues. India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, right? It has nothing to do with G20. The only thing is that the announcement was made from the platform of G20. Otherwise, it is basically it is more like a bilateral agreement, not exactly bilateral. This is more about these group of 5-6 countries coming together and signing the agreement, right? So basically, what has been announced from the platform of G20 but has nothing exactly to do with G20 is the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, and these are the countries which are joining it: India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, Italy, France and Germany, right? So basically it is an economic corridor. If you see this slide, it tells you that starting from India's ports, you go to Gulf of Aden, West Asia, and then of course there will be some rail connectivity happening between the West Asian or Middle East countries, and from there through seas it is going to reach Europe, right? As a practitioner of IR, what immediately comes to my mind is International North-South Transport Corridor, but I'll come to that a little later, right? It is going to have some negative impact on INSTC, but anyways, this is what has been announced, right? So we will now see what exactly is, what are the implications, right? What is the project and why it has been announced. So basically, this connectivity corridor is collaboration between Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, right, PGII, and countries in Middle East, Europe and India, right? PGII basically is an initiative of G7 countries, right? It was announced last year, and it is basically a mechanism through which these countries have agreed to build sustainable infrastructure. This is the word used in their documents, because when you say the word sustainable development or infrastructure, what should come to your mind directly is a BRI, because BRI has been associated in public memory with debt traps, right? So this is one thing, right, that PGII, so technically you can say it marks India's entry into G7 connectivity projects now, and India is not joining BRI. Obviously it violates India's sovereignty. This is why India is not part of BRI, okay? So that is one point. The second issue here is the combined GDP of the countries involved in this corridor stands at US 47 trillion combined GDP, all the countries that I told you. It is almost half of the world GDP, right? So these countries coming together, it is another version of globalization now, right? So that has to be kept in mind. And as of now, whatever details are there in public domain, this will have two corridors. One is the eastern corridor that will connect India to the Gulf region, that is the eastern part, and it will have a northern corridor that will connect the Gulf region to the Europe, right? Gulf and of course India will naturally get connected. So these are the two corridors. And mind you, this is a multimodal project. Multimodal is that has almost all the connectivity types. So you have railway connectivity, road connectivity, and also sea connectivity, right? And according to a statement that has been made by the chief of EU Commissioner, she said that this route will make trade between India and Europe 40% faster. 40% faster, because currently we are using the route which comes from Suez Canal, right? So that this is the basic concept behind having this initiative. Now the other aspects is that these are some of the areas. It will boost trade, transport, energy resources, and also improve digital connectivity. We have just discussed digital part. India is the main, superpower today in terms of digital connectivity, right? So that is how it is going to be connected. And mind you, see, it also hints at the normalization of Saudi-Israel relations in coming months. Because of Palestine issue, Saudis have never normalized their relations with Israel. What does it mean? It means that neither Israel has an embassy in Saudi Arabia nor Saudi Arabia has an embassy in Israel. Okay, but if you are reading the current affairs, you would very well know that Saudi Arabia's strategic partner UAE and Bahrain, they normalized their relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords in 2020, and America has been pushing Saudi Arabia to normalize relations. So if they have agreed to a corridor, right, my sense is that in coming months you will see Saudi Arabia will normalize relations with Israel, right? And it will be something which will be good for India's diplomacy, because when your friends fight less with each other, it becomes easy to balance, right? So that is a good news coming maybe some months down the line. At the same time, use of the land route in the Arabian Peninsula could mean bypassing the congested Suez Canal, right? If you are going to use the land connectivity through West Asia, that would mean that you would want to bypass Suez Canal, because it is becoming congested every year. 2 years back, it was blocked for some time. So the way is that if you want connectivity of future, you need to find alternatives. This is one alternative, right? And of course, due to issues involved, international north-south transport corridor is not picking up the pace, because the key problem here is that Iran is under sanctions, and there are associated problems with international north-south transport corridor, because this project was signed by India in 2000. Initially India, Iran and Russia came together to have connectivity and an alternative to Suez Canal route, but it has taken a lot of time, and there are issues involved, mainly American sanctions on Iran, right? So can we have the other part? So that is the significance of this corridor. And also this is being positioned as a modern day spice route. Remember, there used to be a spice route that used to connect India with Europe, right? So this may be a modern version of it, okay? And more significantly, as a ideological alternative to China's BRI. This is what I've said in the beginning, that China's BRI has been facing a number of problems, right? From China's economic issues to people moving out of BRI. For example, the only G7 country to join BRI was Italy, but in New Delhi, the Prime Minister of Italy conveyed to the Chinese that we are moving out of BRI because it is not something which creates sustainable development. It is something that creates what you call the debt traps, okay, right? So this, and the very good thing about this corridor is that neither it is an ideological grouping nor it is a security alliance, right? These countries share one philosophy, and that is, this is an aggregation that comes together to build a better future for all who reside here, right? All the member countries want to ensure new form of globalization for their people, and this is where comes the the motto given by our Prime Minister, human-centric globalization. What unites these people? The markets are uniting them, right? A common philosophy to market. So that is the part. And of course, unlike the BRI, what you find in BRI, as I said, debt traps. Here, all the countries are equal partners, right? Sustainable connectivity, because there will be no debt traps, and respect for territorial sovereignty and integrity of all the countries involved, right? BRI, as I told you that, it violates India's sovereignty. This is why India is not part of BRI. And these are examples of equal partners, right? Nobody is pushing anybody in a particular direction. There are no conditions involved. And mind you, BRI is a China-centric connectivity. Every economy needs to get connected to China, right? Well, whether they will get connectivity among themselves is a question mark. For example, will Kazakhstan get connected to Kyrgyzstan? There is no surety, but both of them can connect it to China. So this is what you should understand by BRI, that it is all about getting connected to China's supply chains, right? Whether your internal economic need is there or not, nobody, I mean, will answer this question, right? And then of course, as BRI turns 10 this year, the data reveals that the value of new foreign contracted projects under the BRI has stagnated since its peak in 2019, and it has coincided with China's domestic real estate debt crisis, right? So basically what has happened is that the enthusiasm that was there about China's rise, and BRI and things associated with this, it has come down. China's own internal economic crisis has created problems, and this has opened the doors for economies of future. Keep this thing in mind. India is going to be one of the top economies in another 5 to 10 years, and we are planning for times to come. When you require connectivity, this is what happens. This is a connectivity that bypasses Pakistan also, by the way, because Pakistan has never allowed India connectivity to Eurasia, right? So to connect with Eurasia, you need to think, and it all comes when you generally have a very action-oriented foreign and economic policy, right? So these are all the outcomes, and this is all about G20, the concept, the organization, the agenda, the guests, its characteristics, and what have been the major outcomes, right? And please keep this thing in mind. This corridor has been announced from the platform of G20, but it is not an initiative of G20, it is something different, right? And just to cap the discussion, right, in terms of diplomacy, India's G20, as I said, it was most ambitious. It was able to achieve consensus, right? And it shows the power of your diplomacy, because when India put the foot down, and we said that we require the consensus, right? Give us the wording you want, we require a consensus, right? So even we were able to bring, fighting group, the countries that were fighting with each other, we were able to bring them bring together and achieve a declaration. This is what is the real significance of G20. It is India's coming out party to the world, and as Professor Harshpant says, after this, India's foreign policy will never be the same. You will see that in times to come. Thank you very much.